right, so we're continuing our conversation around dual relationship and boundary crossing. And so it's really important to be aware that sometimes dual relationships are unavoidable. We just referenced in the last slide that sometimes in rural locations especially, it's kind of inevitable and unavoidable. And so we need to really analyze why they are occurring, if they should be allowed to occur, and if they are occurring, and should we stop them, and all those fun little details. So different pieces of analyzation are, you want to assess the current and future relationships on the dimensions of power, duration, and termination. And so one of the things I really encourage social work students to keep in mind is that we're coming into a lot of our social work relationships with power dynamics. And this might be super unintentional. We're not coming in thinking that we are some sort of savior. Maybe we are. Hopefully we're not. That we're coming with a mindset that we have this power to help save this poor, disadvantaged individual. Doing that creates all of these different types of power dynamics, which can be very, very detrimental for a client. They might feel the urge to perform. They might have some feelings of being less than, and it can be very exploitive and traumatic, and really kind of cause some real harm to the client's psyche and their well-being. And so we have to be aware that anytime that we're creating an additional layer of a relationship, are we exercising our power in a healthy way, in a manipulative way, in a way that's unfair and harmful to the client? And so that might be a matter of, I think I might have used this one before, and it's actually going to come up in the case study that we're going to do later, where a therapist might say, or a social worker might say, well, and they're working with a client who is using alcohol, they might say, well, if you tell me that you're using, I'll never see you again. Wow, that's kind of abusing your power within the therapeutic relationship. If you were hanging out outside of the relation, or out of the therapeutic relationship as a support and using that, that's super harmful, and it's super big abuse of power. You're going to want to look at the duration and how you terminated relationships. Are you still having an ongoing therapeutic relationship? Did you provide them with the appropriate supports? If they want to continue being your friend outside of the therapeutic relationship because you know that they want to talk to you still about what's going on, that's not helpful. So have you provided appropriate referrals to a new therapist so they can get that need met through them? All of these things you really want to be aware of. Determine the extent of role incompatibility. So if there is this urge to have a dual relationship, and maybe it's unintentional, you need to weigh, is it really beneficial for you to still be in that clinical role? So I had a case manager where she was taking care of a client and then happened to be at a gas station. She was a case manager. She's at a gas station with her husband, and they happened to see her husband's friend, and out of the car pops her friend, or her client, who happened to be dating her husband's friend. And so they then had to sit and think, is it really beneficial for me to still continue to be your case manager because I now have this unintentional dual relationship? Like, we might go hang out at the same place, and am I your case manager, or am I your friend? Do I want to see you in environments outside of the therapeutic relationship? What if the boyfriend talks to the case manager's husband about how annoying his girlfriend is, or says something, and then your husband tells you? Is that a breach of confidentiality? It gets really messy. So you really need to determine, is the continuation of your therapeutic role going to be helpful if this dual relationship is unavoidable? You always want to seek consultation. Always talk to your supervisor, because it's going to help cover your butt too. So if you're dealing with something and you might be trying to navigate it in the best way, if something comes out and the client accuses you of harming them within this dual relationship and you haven't consulted with your supervisor, it makes you very vulnerable for losing your license or getting some sort of infraction on it. So you always want to make sure, if there's ever the potential that might be a dual relationship, you want to make sure that your supervisor is in the know, because they can hopefully advise you more objectively and take some of the emotions out of it. And discuss the decision with clients in terms of possible ramifications. So like I said, with the situation where the case manager knew the client was dating the friend of the family, be having a very candid conversation of like, hey, I know this person. I'm aware that we have this overlap of people in our lives. What is this going to look like? Do you feel comfortable continuing? Do you not? Sometimes it might be where you can't change. So we've had a situation where a boyfriend and girlfriend were in our clinic together. They were seeing the same psychiatrist because it was the only one available. However, they were seeing two different therapists. The girlfriend was talking to her therapist about how abusive and horrible and how many substances her boyfriend was using. Well, then her boyfriend was telling his therapist about how clean and sober he was and how proud he was of his sobriety. Well, then we would go into case consults with the psychiatrist. This information would be shared at an open consult, and it'd be like, oh, shoot, what do we do with this? There's a conflict of interest. There's these dual relationships going on. How do we navigate this? Letting the clients know, hey, this is going on. You share a psychiatrist. You be able to make sure that they know that you're not breaching confidentiality. It gets really messy, but giving clients the power to self-determine if they want to continue relationships, as long as it's still therapeutically beneficial, is a really important step to take. Instead of doing things behind the client's back, you want to make sure they have self-determination and in how these situations are being navigated, as long as it is not harming the client. So how can we set good boundaries and avoid dual relationships? We just need to acknowledge that it's really hard. Like I mentioned earlier in the narrative on this page, on the Sakai page, is that we enter this profession because we want to help people, and often our intentions are not to be harmful. We just genuinely want to help. And if it's like, oh yeah, like I have a car, so I can drive you to get your Diet Coke at McDonald's after your doctor's appointment, like it feels really icky saying no because I have the means to help you and get something that you want. But is it therapeutically beneficial? Is it helping the client reach their goals? Often symptomology related to mental illness diagnoses is where you test boundaries and don't have necessarily the ability to navigate social situations in a healthy way, or it's part of their maladaptive coping is to push boundaries to see if somebody cares. And so it can be easy to get, I don't want to say bullied into it, but kind of bullied into it, because it's really hard to say no to a client who might be pushing the envelope or really wanting something from you. I had an extremely hard time with a client. She was in her 50s, maybe her 60s. She was very, very lonely, and she really enjoyed, she almost started seeing our therapy sessions as a friendship, because she is someone who I probably would have loved to hang out outside of the therapeutic relationship. She was wonderful. I adored her. But she started bringing gifts in for my kids. She'd go thrifting and come and bring clothes to me. And I was like, okay, this is starting to fall into a dual relationship. And now the Code of Ethics has statements, has some like caveat that if a client is trying to give you gifts, and it would be harmful for them to say no, you are allowed to accept them, but understand that any harm caused to them, you are ultimately responsible for. And so it was easy to pull that justification in of like, if I said no, it would really hurt her feelings. It would not help the therapeutic relationship. It would push her away. So I would ultimately accept them. And then our agency policy was to let the clinic know that you received a gift. And if anybody wanted access to them, they could. Nobody really would. But you had to kind of go do that kind of thing to cover your butt. But ultimately, it started to blur the lines, and it became unhealthy for the client, for me and the client's therapeutic relationship, because she'd want to come in and talk about me. She didn't want to talk about her. She wanted to avoid some of the uncomfortable feelings, and she did that by trying to engage more into my life and get me to talk about my kids. And so when I initially started disclosing a little bit of information because it helped build the therapeutic relationship. It then ended up becoming unhealthy because it blurred the lines, and I had to then retract and kind of refocus. And that was a really difficult conversation to like start implementing more boundaries, because it hurt her feelings because she saw me as a friend, not a therapist anymore. And then I took this position at Kuiper, and then that's how I ended the therapeutic relationship. And I had to be very clear that I could not become her friend on Facebook. I could not meet her for coffee. And you could see that really hurt her. And she ended up pulling back in those last few sessions as a way of coping from the hurt. And then I had to like realize that like I probably contributed to the hurt because I allowed our therapeutic relationship to have too much of a casual tone. There was a dual relationship, even though it wasn't my intent. I just wanted her to feel valued, and that I appreciated her as a person. But it ended up ultimately blurring the line. And if I could go back and do that, I realized like that was not probably the most healthy approach to the therapeutic relationship, because it didn't keep the intent of therapy focused on her. It let her avoid a lot of things that she wanted to avoid. It didn't encourage her to find supports outside of the therapeutic relationship. Thankfully, it didn't, to my knowledge, cause her like super duper harm, but it could have, and it could have made me very vulnerable as well. So I will always take that to heart, that sometimes those tough conversations suck in the moment, but ultimately it's the best teaching opportunity for your clients and protects yourself. So strategies to setting good boundaries, because we've acknowledged that it is hard, is you want to examine your motivations for going beyond the expectations of your job. Is it because you have a difficulty of saying no? Are you afraid of making your clients upset with you? Are you having some sort of countertransference where you are trying to deal with your own issues by means of doing this? That's that self-reflection piece. When you have this knee-jerk reaction to enter into a dual relationship or cross some sort of boundary, look at what your motivation is. And you want to learn and use effective communication in all settings across all systems. And so kind of going back to example with the client I was just talking about, I needed to figure out how to effectively set the boundaries. I can't assume that she knows that I'm uncomfortable or that she shouldn't be doing X, Y, or Z. I have to use very clear language out of respect for her and for myself to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And then recognizing that going beyond your professional boundaries with clients can put your colleagues in organizations in a position of harm or failure. And essentially that is because you're not necessarily providing therapeutic services for the client. It might seem good in a moment. It might put a Band-Aid on the situation. It might get somebody housed, or it might prevent them from harm in the moment. But is it really giving a sustainable long-term solution in an ethical way? And that then can come back and impact your license. It can impact your agency's ability to receive funding. You really need to recognize that there's a bigger piece and there's a reason why the boundary was put in place in the first place. So it's, again, a lot of self-awareness, using objective support. So somebody who might not be as emotionally involved in the process is really helpful when you're trying to set these good boundaries. I think another thing to really be mindful in pointing out is you want to be discriminate in your use of social media. We're going to talk about this in a class further down the road, because there's a whole part of the Code of Ethics that talks about social media etiquette and what's appropriate. But I'm going to encourage you all to privatize your settings. A lot of people will use their first name and their middle name instead of their first and last name, so they're not as searchable. Never, ever friend or follow clients. It is not appropriate. As tempting as it is not appropriate. And I think the one that we tend to maybe engage in a little bit more, because it's less of like a paper trail, is creeping on clients' social media. So searching them up, seeing what's going on, looking at their Instagram, their Facebook, Googling them. You got to go back to the dignity and worth of the individual. Why are you doing that? Is that promoting their dignity and worth? What is your intent? What happens if you find something on there that says I want to hurt myself, or you're in a substance use program and you find on their social media that they're using? What do you do with that? Do you confront them? Do you then have to own up to it? So don't do it. It is not ethical, and it is not a healthy boundary for you to be engaging with a client. And then avoid posting negative information about your organization or your clients on social media, because that, again, can go back. If they happen to find that, it can really impact the dignity and worth. Like, are you using it? Are you using this person's information for drama and for likes or humor? It just does not respect the client. So those are not healthy things to engage